Picture this. You're lying in bed, the room is dark, and your mind just won't stop racing. You need something to pull your focus away from the noise of the day, but you don't want anything too intense, nothing that's going to spike your adrenaline or keep you wide awake. What you need is a calm, steady voice walking you through fascinating little details about a world you love. And if that world happens to be The Boys, one of the most creative, wildly imaginative television universes ever built, then you are in exactly the right place tonight. So go ahead and get comfortable. Pull that blanket up. Close your eyes if you want. We're just going to talk about this incredible show, the hidden layers underneath it, the fascinating connections, the little facts that make the whole thing feel even richer. There's no pressure here. Just settle in and let the words wash over you. The Boys as a television series didn't start from nowhere. It came from a comic book written by Garth Ennis, which was itself a pretty wild and darkly satirical take on what the world might look like if superheroes actually existed and were managed by a massive corporation. But when Eric Kripke adapted it for television, he brought something completely unique to it. Now here's what makes that interesting in a sleepy sort of way. Eric Kripke isn't just the showrunner of The Boys. He's also the creator of another enormously beloved television series called Supernatural, which ran for 15 full seasons and developed one of the most devoted fan followings in television history. So when you watch The Boys, you are watching something created by the same mind that built that entire other universe. Two very different worlds, same creative fingerprint running through both of them. And because of that connection, The Boys has quietly become something of a reunion place for actors who spent years working on Supernatural. Jensen Ackles, who plays the character Soldier Boy on The Boys, is probably the most famous example of this. He played one of the two lead characters on Supernatural for the entire run of the show. But he's not alone. Many of the actors and people involved in The Boys passed through Supernatural at some point along the way. This creates a kind of invisible thread that runs beneath the surface of The Boys, connecting it to all those years of supernatural storytelling. For fans who know both shows, watching The Boys sometimes feels like a homecoming in the most unexpected and wonderful way. Let's drift a little deeper into the world of Soldier Boy specifically, because his character is one of the most layered and quietly tragic figures in the entire show. On the surface, he comes across as a brutish relic from another era, a man out of time in the worst possible way, someone who holds onto outdated ideas and throws his weight around with zero self-awareness. But underneath that, there are these small, almost tender moments that keep slipping through. His relationship with Homelander, for instance, slowly develops into something that feels genuinely paternal, which is deeply ironic given how monstrous both of them can be. Watching two people who are essentially walking disasters find some kind of father and son connection is one of those things that only The Boys could pull off without it feeling absurd. Homelander himself is one of the most psychologically complex antagonists in recent television history, and there's something almost meditative about thinking through who he actually is when you strip away all the laser eyes and the cape. At his core, he is a deeply abandoned person. He grew up in a laboratory. He had no parents, no family, no genuine human connection. Everything he knows about love and belonging came from the outside world watching him from behind glass, or from a public that worships him without actually knowing him. And that worship became the thing he built his entire identity around. So when that worship feels threatened, or when someone gets close enough to make him feel something real, he can't handle it. The vulnerability terrifies him. And so he destroys it. There's something almost unbearably human about that, even though he is clearly portrayed as a villain. The show never lets you forget that monsters are made, not born. Now let's think about the corporation at the center of everything, Vought International. The writers built Vought as a satire of corporate America in the most elaborate and detailed way. They have their own media empire, their own film studio, their own product lines, their own political connections. They've essentially made superheroes into a brand, and that brand is worth more to them than anything else, including the actual human beings involved. The dark satirical twist is that this doesn't feel that far from reality. The way celebrity is managed, the way public image is constructed and protected, the way corporations will sacrifice individuals to preserve their reputation. The Boys takes all of that and just turns the volume up to an almost unbearable degree. And yet somehow, the closer you look at it, the more familiar it starts to feel. One of the quieter and more interesting creative choices the show makes is how it handles its in-universe media. There are advertisements, movies, news broadcasts, social media posts, merchandise, all existing within the world of the show as if this is just the normal backdrop of life. The in-universe film called Dawn of the Seven, for example, is treated within the show as a massive blockbuster production, with all the behind-the-scenes drama and ego conflicts you would expect from a real Hollywood production. This layering of fictional media within the show's already fictional world creates a strange depth to everything. You start to understand how these characters are perceived by the ordinary public who can't see what we see as the audience. The gap between public image and private reality is one of the central tensions the show keeps returning to again and again. Let's talk about the character of Sage for a moment, because she is one of the most quietly unsettling people in the entire series. She is presented as the smartest person alive, someone whose intelligence is so vast that it becomes its own kind of curse. Her backstory involves a grandmother who loved her, a medical establishment that dismissed her, and a grief that eventually curdled into something deeply cold. She doesn't want power for the reasons most people want power. She doesn't want fame or control or adoration. What she actually wants is to be left alone. And she has come to believe that the only way the world will ever leave her alone is if it essentially tears itself apart. That is a specific kind of nihilism that the show presents not as cartoonish villainy but as something that grew organically from real pain. It's disturbing precisely because you can trace the emotional logic of it even if the conclusion is monstrous. The reference the show makes to a famous episode of The Twilight Zone is particularly rich for those who catch it. In that old black and white episode, a bookworm who just wants peace and quiet to read survives a nuclear apocalypse and finally has all the time in the world to read every book he's ever wanted. And then his glasses break. It's one of the most heartbreaking ironic endings in all of classic television. The connection to Sage's plan in The Boys is genuinely clever, because it raises the same question. Even if she gets what she wants, even if the world burns and she's left in silence, will it actually give her what she's looking for? Or will there be some equally devastating irony waiting for her at the end? Now let's drift towards something a little lighter. The comedy in The Boys is something that deserves its own moment of appreciation. The show is technically a dark superhero satire, but it operates with a very specific comedic sensibility that goes far beyond simple parody. There are jokes layered inside jokes, cultural references folded into absurdist situations, and a willingness to go to places that most television writers would never dare approach. What keeps it from feeling gratuitous is that the comedy usually serves a purpose. The most outrageous moments are often also the most pointed criticisms of something real. The grossness is frequently the point. When something makes you recoil and laugh at the same time, you're being forced to confront your own reaction, which is exactly what good satire should do. Terra, Butcher's dog, is one of those details that the show uses with surprising emotional depth. On the surface, a dog who behaves exactly the way Terra behaves is just pure comedy. But within the context of the show, the dog represents something about Butcher himself. Butcher is a man who has burned almost every meaningful human connection in his life. He is abrasive and ruthless and self-destructive in ways that push people away. But the dog stays. The dog doesn't care about any of that. And the scenes between Butcher and Terra carry this quiet emotional weight that sneaks up on you if you let it. The show uses that animal connection to remind you that even the most damaged people have some corner of themselves where something soft still lives. The relationship between Kimiko and Frenchie is another one of those emotional cores that the show returns to throughout its run. Kimiko doesn't speak in the traditional sense for much of the series, and yet her relationship with Frenchie is one of the most communicative and emotionally alive connections in the whole show. They understand each other without words in ways that the more verbally expressive characters never quite manage. There's a tenderness between them that exists in contrast to all the violence surrounding them. And the show is smart enough to complicate that tenderness too, to let it feel fragile and uncertain in the way real relationships do, rather than just presenting it as a safe harbor in a storm. Here's an interesting little detail about the world building that doesn't always get talked about. The show takes great care to establish its own internal history, its own mythology about how superheroes came to exist and how Vought built its empire around them. References to past decades, to earlier generations of heroes, to experiments and cover-ups and historical events that Vought quietly influenced. This isn't just window dressing. It creates a sense that the world of the boys has been going on long before we arrive to watch it, and will continue in some form after the story ends. That historical depth is part of what makes the fictional corporation feel so believably menacing. They didn't build this overnight. This is the result of decades of careful, deliberate manipulation. The character of Starlight, Annie January, sits at a very specific intersection that the show finds particularly interesting. She came into the Seven as someone who genuinely believed in the possibility of being a hero, of using extraordinary abilities to do actual good. She wasn't naive exactly, but she was idealistic in a way that the world of the show immediately began attacking from every direction. Watching her hold onto pieces of that idealism while also becoming something harder and more practical is one of the ongoing emotional journeys of the series. She represents the question of whether it's possible to maintain your values inside a corrupt system, or whether the system always wins eventually. Mother's Milk is one of those characters where the show does something genuinely thoughtful with motivation. His reasons for being in the fight against Vought are deeply personal, connected to family history and loss in ways that make his commitment feel grounded in something real rather than abstract heroism. And the show pays attention to how that personal history shapes the way he sees the larger mission. He's not fighting for some general idea of justice. He's fighting for something specific and human, which is ultimately what makes him one of the most relatable people in a cast of characters who are frequently operating at the extreme edges of human behavior. Think for a moment about how the show handles power specifically, physical superhuman power, and what it does to people psychologically. Almost every superhero in The Boys who has significant power has been damaged by it in some way. Either they were given it too young, or under circumstances that were traumatic, or in a context where the power was immediately used to corrupt rather than protect. The show seems to argue pretty consistently that power in the hands of people who haven't developed the emotional and moral framework to use it responsibly is one of the most dangerous things imaginable, which maps directly onto critiques of real-world power structures, even without the supernatural element. There's something deeply satisfying about how the show builds and releases tension across episodes. It doesn't follow a predictable rhythm. You can be deep in a comedic sequence and then suddenly something genuinely affecting happens. Or you can be braced for something terrible and the show pivots into absurdist humor instead. This unpredictability is part of what keeps people watching, but it also creates a specific emotional experience where you're never quite settled, never quite sure what register the show is operating in at any given moment. Which, when you think about it, is also what living inside a world with unchecked powerful people might actually feel like. The satirical targets of The Boys are broad in scope but consistent in their angle of attack. Corporate greed, celebrity worship, religious manipulation, political opportunism, media complicity. These aren't separate themes that the show visits occasionally. They're woven together into a single interconnected critique of how power operates in modern society. And the show does this without ever becoming preachy, which is genuinely difficult. The secret is that the satire is always expressed through character and situation rather than through direct statement. Nobody steps up to deliver a lecture. The critique lives in what happens, in the consequences characters face, in the gaps between what characters say and what they actually do. Let's close out this evening with the idea that makes The Boys perhaps most interesting as a thought experiment. The superheroes in this show are not heroes in any meaningful sense. They are celebrities who happen to have extraordinary abilities. The corporation treats them as products. The public treats them as gods. And many of them have come to believe the mythology built around them. The question the show quietly asks underneath all the chaos and violence and dark comedy is a simple one. What would it actually take to hold power accountable? And the answer the show keeps returning to is that it takes ordinary people refusing to stop, even when the cost is enormous, even when the odds are completely ridiculous, even when it seems like the forces aligned against them are simply too vast and too entrenched to ever be moved. That's not a comfortable answer, but it's an honest one. And on that note, you can let all of that settle gently into the back of your mind, into that place where the thoughts get quieter and the body gets heavier and the night wraps around you like something familiar and warm. There's nothing more to figure out tonight. The world of the boys will still be there tomorrow, full of its wild characters and impossible situations and hidden layers waiting to be noticed. But right now, this moment is just for resting. So breathe slowly, let the thoughts drift off one by one, and drift gently into sleep knowing you've spent these quiet minutes well. The show that made superheroes terrifying is ending, and the secrets buried inside Season 5 are almost too wild to say out loud. The Boys has been building toward this moment for years. Season 5 was announced as the final season of the show, meaning everything the writers, producers, cast, and crew have been constructing since the very beginning was always pointing toward this conclusion. That weight is hard to overstate. When a show knows it is ending, the energy around it changes entirely. The desperation to tie things together properly, to honor what came before, to go out on a high note rather than fizzle away like so many shows before it. That pressure shapes every single decision made in the writing room, on set, and in the editing bay. And from everything that has come out about Season 5, that pressure was very much felt by everyone involved. Let us start with something that might surprise you if you have been following the show casually. The Boys is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robertson. The comic ran from 2006 to 2012, and it was genuinely one of the most provocative, boundary-pushing pieces of comic book storytelling ever published. But here is the thing that makes the show fascinating from a creative standpoint. The television adaptation does not follow the comic closely. It uses the comic as a launching pad, a source of tone and certain characters and some plot threads, but the show has branched off dramatically in its own direction. This means that even readers of the original comics were watching Season 5 without knowing exactly how things would end. The show carved out its own mythology, its own version of these characters, and its own conclusion that does not simply mirror what the comics did. That creative independence is genuinely rare, and it is one of the reasons the show has felt so alive and unpredictable. Now, as you settle in a little deeper, let me tell you something about the production scale of Season 5 that is worth appreciating. The Boys is one of the most expensive television productions in Amazon Prime Video's history. The visual effects work alone is staggering. Every season has pushed the boundaries of what streaming television can accomplish visually, and Season 5 was described by those involved as the most ambitious in terms of scope and scale. The final season needed to deliver on years of storytelling, which meant the action sequences, the world-building moments, and the character payoffs all had to feel larger than anything that came before. That is a significant undertaking. The crew behind the scenes, the visual effects artists, the stunt coordinators, the costume designers, all of them were working toward creating something that would feel like a proper cinematic finale rather than just another television episode. One of the most interesting things about The Boys as a show is what it actually represents beneath all the violence and the satire. At its core, the show has always been a story about power. Specifically, about what happens when power goes completely unchecked. Homelander, the show's central villain played with absolutely terrifying commitment by Anthony Starr, is not just a bad superhero. He is a portrait of narcissism, trauma, and the catastrophic consequences of giving someone with unresolved psychological damage complete and unlimited power. Season 5 had to reckon with what that character arc ultimately meant. Where does someone like Homelander end up? What does the world look like if he wins? What does it look like if he loses? These are not simple questions, and the show has never offered simple answers. Anthony Starr's performance across the entire run of The Boys has been one of television's great acting achievements. The way he plays Homelander, with this terrifying combination of desperate neediness and volcanic rage, is genuinely unsettling. In interviews leading up to Season 5, Starr spoke about the emotional toll of inhabiting this character, about the difficulty of finding the final note for someone this complex. He wanted to make sure the ending felt honest to who Homelander had always been rather than convenient or tidy. That kind of investment from a lead actor in the final stretch of a show makes a real difference to the quality of the finished product. Let your mind wander a little here. Think about the world of The Boys for a moment. It is a world where superheroes are not government-operated. They are corporate products, managed, marketed, and monetized by a massive conglomerate called Vought International. The genius of this concept is how it mirrors real-world conversations about celebrity, corporate power, and the commodification of heroism. The show is not subtle about its satirical targets. It has taken aim at media companies, political movements, celebrity culture, and the ways in which the public can be manipulated through carefully crafted narratives. Season 5 pushed these themes further than any previous season, with the political landscape of the show's world mirroring real-world tensions in ways that made some viewers genuinely uncomfortable in the best possible way. Here is a fact that might keep your curiosity ticking just long enough before sleep takes over. The character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty, underwent one of the most significant character evolutions in the show's history. When we first met Annie January in Season 1, she was an idealistic young woman genuinely excited about becoming a superhero. By Season 5, she had been through experiences that would have broken most people. What the writers did with her journey was track how someone maintains their fundamental goodness under impossible pressure. Moriarty has spoken about how physically and emotionally demanding the later seasons were, and how the final season required her to dig into emotional territory she had never accessed in previous years. The relationship between Starlight and Butcher, these two people from completely different worlds who end up needing each other in unexpected ways, became one of the emotional cores of the finale. Speaking of Billy Butcher, Carl Urban's portrayal of this character has been another one of the show's great accomplishments. Butcher begins the show as something close to a straightforward anti-hero, a man with a mission, brutal methods, and a reason that feels somewhat sympathetic. But as the show progressed, the cracks in his character deepened, and the show began asking harder questions about whether Butcher was actually the good guy he believed himself to be. Season 5 had to answer those questions definitively. Urban has talked in interviews about how he wanted the final season to honor all the complexity that had been built into this character without giving him an easy redemption or an unearned fall. The nuance required for that kind of performance is considerable. Now let us drift into some behind-the-scenes territory that is genuinely fascinating. Eric Kripke, the showrunner of The Boys, is the creative force at the center of everything. He spent years working on the adaptation, developing it from a relatively straightforward pitch into something much more politically charged and thematically ambitious. Kripke has been very vocal about wanting the show to feel genuinely dangerous, to push into territory that makes audiences question their own assumptions. In the lead-up to Season 5, he described the writer's room process as the most intense of the entire series, with debates about where characters needed to end up that sometimes got genuinely heated. That collaborative tension is often what produces the most interesting creative outcomes. One of the things that makes The Boys unique in the television landscape is its willingness to destroy characters that audiences have invested in. The show has never been precious about its cast. Major characters have been killed off in shocking ways throughout the run, and Season 5 was not going to break that tradition. The unpredictability of the show is one of its greatest assets because it means viewers can never fully relax. Even in your most comfortable sleep-adjacent state, your brain is probably somewhere in the back registering the fact that nobody on this show is truly safe. That tension is deliberately maintained by the writers as a tool to keep audiences engaged and to give the story genuine stakes. Let me tell you something about the music of The Boys that does not get discussed enough. The show has always used music in a deeply intentional way. The soundtrack choices, often popular songs deployed in moments of extreme violence or emotional irony, are a signature element of the show's aesthetic language. The music department for Season 5 had a significant task in front of them. How do you choose songs for the final chapter that feel like a culmination of the show's musical identity while also serving the specific emotional needs of each scene? The team behind the music, working alongside the directors, spent considerable time making those decisions. The result is a final season where the music feels both familiar in its approach and fresh in its specific selections. There is something worth knowing about the physical production of The Boys that is easy to overlook when you are watching it from your couch or your bed. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, though it regularly creates the impression of being set across the United States and beyond. The production design team builds environments of extraordinary detail. The Vought Tower interiors, the suburban neighborhoods, the underground spaces where the boys operate, all of these are constructed with a level of care that makes them feel lived in rather than like television sets. That groundedness is part of what makes the fantastical elements of the show land so effectively. When something impossible happens in a space that feels completely real, the impact is significantly greater. As you let yourself sink a little deeper into that comfortable state between awake and asleep, here is something to turn over in your mind. The Boys, particularly in its final season, was dealing with questions about legacy. What does it mean to fight against something enormous and corrupt? Does it matter if you win or lose? Can one person or one small group actually change the systems that seem too large to touch? These are not questions unique to a fictional world. They resonate because they are questions people genuinely grapple with when they look at institutions and power structures that feel immovable. The show never pretends to have easy answers, and that intellectual honesty is part of what has made it matter to so many people. The relationship between The Boys and its audience is genuinely interesting from a sociological standpoint. The show has attracted a fan base that is extraordinarily passionate, but it has also attracted attention from people who perhaps missed some of the satire and interpreted certain characters as aspirational rather than cautionary. This is something Kripke and the cast have addressed publicly on multiple occasions, particularly around the character of Homelander. The writers had to be mindful in Season 5 of how they were closing out this character's story in a way that was unambiguous about the show's moral position without becoming preachy or simplistic. That is a genuinely difficult creative challenge, and how they navigated it is one of the more discussed aspects of the final season. Let your breathing slow down a little. Let the details of the day drift back. We are going to keep moving through these fascinating layers of a show that has meant a lot to a lot of people. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of the best assembled groups in streaming television history. Beyond the leads, the supporting players have been essential to the show's texture. Characters like Frenchie, played by Toma Capone, and Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, provided the show with emotional counterweights to some of its heavier material. Their relationship across the entire run became one of the most genuinely touching elements of a show that is not exactly known for being gentle. Season 5 had to find the right conclusion for them as well, and the care taken with their arc in the final season reflects how seriously the writers took every thread in this story. There is something worth mentioning about the guest cast and special appearances that Season 5 featured. One of the joys of a show like The Boys is the way it occasionally pulls in surprising names for limited appearances, often deploying them in ways that are simultaneously unexpected and completely logical given the show's satire-driven world. The final season used this approach strategically, bringing in faces that felt significant in the context of what the show was saying about celebrity and power rather than just as stunt casting for its own sake. Here is something genuinely fascinating about the writing process for Season 5. The writers' room for the final season reportedly knew from very early in the process which character deaths were coming, which relationships would resolve, and what the final image of the show would be. Working backward from a known ending is a different creative experience than building a season with the destination still uncertain. It allowed the writers to plant seeds and establish patterns that would pay off in specific ways, creating a season that felt architecturally coherent from beginning to end rather than making things up as they went. That structural intentionality is evident in retrospect when you look at how storylines that seemed disconnected early in the season ultimately converged. The visual language of Season 5 represented an evolution of the show's aesthetic approach. The directors brought in for the final season worked closely with cinematographer to develop a look that felt slightly different from previous years, signaling that this chapter was something distinct. There is a quality to the lighting choices and camera movement in the final season that feels heavier, more deliberate, as if the world itself knows that something conclusive is coming. These are the kinds of craft decisions that audiences often feel without being able to articulate why a scene hits differently than expected. Let us talk about something that has been a consistent strength of the show from the very beginning. The Boys has always done exceptional work with its female characters. In a genre that has historically not prioritized the depth and complexity of its women, The Boys gave its female characters genuine agency, genuine flaws, genuine contradictions. Queen Maeve, played by Dominique McElligott, had one of the show's most interesting arcs in earlier seasons. The show has not been content to let female characters exist primarily in relation to male ones. They have their own drives, their own histories, their own failures and triumphs. Season 5 continued this commitment to complexity, giving its women material that was as rich and challenging as anything given to the male leads. There is a fascinating parallel that runs through the final season between individual psychology and institutional corruption. The show has always understood that systems do not become corrupt on their own. They are corrupted by people, by specific choices made by specific individuals who have the power to do differently. Season 5 traced this connection with particular precision, showing how the personal wounds and unresolved traumas of specific characters rippled outward into consequences affecting millions of people in this fictional world. That psychological framework for understanding systemic problems is actually quite sophisticated and represents some of the show's best thematic work. As you let yourself get even more comfortable, think about this. The Boys managed something that very few shows in the superhero genre have achieved. It made you feel the weight of superpowers as something terrifying rather than aspirational. In most superhero stories, powers are gifts, things to be celebrated and deployed heroically. The Boys reframe them as something closer to a curse, or more accurately, as an amplification of whatever the person already was. Give someone with empathy and good judgment enormous power, and they might do genuinely good things. Give someone with unresolved trauma and narcissistic tendencies that same power, and you get Homelander. Season 5 pushed this idea to its logical conclusion, examining what it finally takes to address something that powerful and that dangerous when the normal mechanisms of accountability have completely broken down. The production crew behind the scenes in Season 5 reached numbers that rivaled major feature film productions. The coordination required to bring a season of this complexity to life involves hundreds of people across departments that audiences rarely think about. The props department alone had to manage an enormous inventory of items specific to this world. The art department had to maintain consistency across a fictional universe that has developed significant internal detail over 5 seasons. The wardrobe team had to manage character looks that had evolved across years while also introducing new visual elements appropriate for the final chapter. All of this invisible work accumulates into the experience of watching an episode and simply believing the world on screen. Here is something that sits at the interesting intersection of fiction and reality that The Boys has always played with. The show frequently references and parodies real-world media culture, political rhetoric, and corporate behavior in ways that are deliberately close to actual events. The writer's room reportedly has a practice of constantly monitoring real-world developments and asking how they can be incorporated or reflected in the story they are telling. This gives the show a quality of immediacy and relevance that many genre shows lack. By Season 5, the political landscape of both the show's world and the real world had become so intertwined that watching certain scenes felt startlingly pointed. Let your mind drift with this next one. There is a character in The Boys named Black Noir who has gone through one of the stranger and more interesting journeys in the show's history. The character's arc across the seasons, including revelations about their nature and identity, reflects the show's willingness to completely subvert audience expectations and then do something genuinely unexpected with the material that emerges from that subversion. Season 5 had to find a meaningful place for the legacy of this character within the larger resolution of the story. The Boys has been consistently praised by critics not just for its entertainment value but for what it represents as a piece of cultural commentary. Television critics who might otherwise be dismissive of superhero content have written seriously about what the show is doing and why it matters. This critical respect has shaped the show's production in interesting ways. When a creative team knows that thoughtful people are paying close attention to what they are saying and how they are saying it, there is an additional layer of accountability that influences decisions. The writers of Season 5 were very much aware that the ending of this show would be analyzed and discussed in depth, and that awareness shaped the ambition of what they attempted. Something worth knowing about the actors as a group is how much they genuinely seem to enjoy each other's company and how that chemistry translates to the screen. The ensemble energy of the boys is not manufactured. The cast has spoken across many interviews about the friendships they have developed over the course of the show and about how working together on the final season carried a genuine emotional weight because they all knew it was coming to an end. That bittersweet awareness of finishing something meaningful permeates the performances in Season 5 in ways that are difficult to quantify but absolutely present. The humor of the boys is one of its most discussed and most divisive elements. The show is genuinely funny, often in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. It uses comedy as a pressure release valve, deploying absurdist or darkly comic moments within sequences of extreme tension in order to manage audience experience in a specific way. Season 5 maintained this balancing act even as the stakes reached their highest point. The ability to be genuinely funny within a story that is also asking serious questions is one of the rarer creative skills, and the writers of The Boys have demonstrated it consistently. There is a quieter element of the show that sometimes gets overshadowed by the more explosive content. The Boys has always found time for small, intimate character moments that exist outside the main plot machinery. Conversations between characters about their fears, their regrets, their hopes for things they believe they do not deserve. These moments, often just two people talking in an unglamorous setting, are where the show does some of its most affecting work. Season 5 included a number of these quieter scenes that longtime fans have pointed to as among the most emotionally resonant in the entire series. Your breathing is probably slower now. Good. Keep going with me just a little longer because there is more worth knowing. The relationship between the boys and the superhero genre more broadly is worth reflecting on. The show arrived at a moment when superhero content was reaching a kind of saturation point in popular culture. Rather than adding to that saturation, it offered a fundamentally different perspective on the genre's assumptions and conventions. It asked what superheroes would actually look like if the world they operated in was recognizably like our own, with the same power dynamics, the same corruption, the same gap between stated values and actual behavior. Season 5 brought this interrogation of the genre to its most pointed and definitive expression. Garth Ennis, the creator of the original comic, has been publicly appreciative of what the television adaptation has done with his source material, even where it diverged significantly. This relationship between original creator and adaptation team is not always harmonious, and the fact that Ennis has expressed genuine enthusiasm for the show speaks to the respect with which the television creators approached the spirit of what he originally created even when they departed from the letter of it. Something to sleep on. The legacy of The Boys as a show will likely be discussed for many years. It arrived at a specific cultural moment and responded to it with genuine creative ambition and moral seriousness. The final season was the opportunity to cement that legacy or undermine it, and by most accounts from both critics and fans, what was delivered in Season 5 was worthy of everything that came before it. Whether you agree with its conclusions, whether you found its resolution satisfying or challenging, the show earned the conversation it prompted. The technical achievement of the visual effects in Season 5 deserves a final mention. The artists and technical teams who created the visual language of this world worked across the entire production timeline, from pre-production design through principal photography and into the long post-production period. Some of the more elaborate sequences in the final season involved effects work that was in development for over a year before the episodes aired. The invisible craft required to make the impossible look ordinary is something that audiences experience as effortless when it works properly, which means the people responsible for it only get noticed when something goes wrong. In Season 5, very little went wrong. The Boys gave us something rare in popular entertainment. A story with genuine moral stakes, characters who were allowed to be genuinely complicated, and a willingness to follow its own logic even when that meant going to uncomfortable places. Season 5 was the conclusion of that promise, the delivery of everything the show had been building toward across years and hundreds of thousands of words of storytelling. And that is a good thought to carry you gently toward sleep tonight. All those years of work, all those people, all those decisions made in rooms you will never see, by people whose names scroll past in credits that go by too fast to read. All of it adding up to something that you watched in the dark, that made you feel things, that gave you something to think about. The world of The Boys is a dark one. But the fact that stories like this get made and watched and talked about says something quietly hopeful about the people who make them and the people who love them. There is something human in wanting to look at power clearly, to refuse to dress it up in a cape and call it good, to insist on asking harder questions even when easier answers are available. So as your thoughts slow down and the details of this fictional world begin to blur at the edges and blend with whatever images your sleeping mind is starting to assemble, just know that you spent this time in good company. With a story that tried to be honest about difficult things. With characters who were messy and human even when they could fly or punch through walls. With a show that knew it was ending and tried to end with integrity. Let the sounds around you fade. Let the weight of everything you carry today get a little lighter. The Boys Season 5 has come and gone, and it left a mark. And now, it is time to rest. Sleep well. Somewhere between waking and sleeping is the perfect place to learn that the most powerful being on Earth got his abilities from a syringe. Not a distant planet, not a radioactive accident, just a very profitable corporation with very few ethical guidelines. The Boys is a show that most people describe as a superhero story, but that description barely scratches the surface of what it actually is. At its core, the whole thing is a really sharp piece of satire. It is asking a question that sounds simple but gets more complicated the longer you sit with it. What would the world actually look like if superheroes were real? And what if they were less concerned with saving people and more concerned with maintaining their brand image? The answer the show keeps arriving at, again and again, is that it would look a lot like the world we already live in, just with more explosions and considerably more chaos. The show is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis, who is known for writing some of the most deliberately provocative and boundary-pushing comics in the medium. He created the source material with artist Derek Robertson, and it ran for about 72 issues between 2006 and 2012. The comics are famously even more extreme than the television adaptation, which is saying quite a lot given how far the show already pushes things. The television version takes the skeleton of the comic, the broad characters, the central premise, the satirical heart of it, and then builds something new around that skeleton. It keeps the spirit alive while finding its own voice. The show is set in a world where a company called Vought International has essentially cornered the market on superheroes. They did not just stumble into this position. They built it deliberately and carefully over decades. Vought is not a government agency or a charity or even a defense contractor in the traditional sense. It is a media and pharmaceutical company first and a superhero management corporation second. Or maybe those two things are reversed. It is genuinely hard to tell sometimes, which is kind of the point. The superheroes in this world are called supes, and most of them got their abilities from a compound called Compound V, which Vought developed and controls. This detail matters enormously to the whole story because it means the existence of superheroes is not some cosmic accident or the result of alien radiation or a spider bite in a science lab. It is a business decision. Vought created them because Vought wanted them, and Vought maintains that monopoly on superhuman creation because it gives them extraordinary leverage over governments, militaries, corporations, and basically everyone else on the planet. Sleep on that thought for a moment. The idea that power is not just acquired but manufactured and then sold. The top team of superheroes in this world is called the Seven, which is obviously a reference to the number 7 but also plays on the idea of these grand teams of heroes you see in other comic universes. They live and work out of something called the Tower. They have action figures and breakfast cereals and streaming deals and everything else you would expect from celebrities of that magnitude. They are not really crime fighters in the traditional sense. They are intellectual properties. They are assets on a balance sheet. The actual heroics they do are mostly carefully staged, or at least carefully presented to make them look as good as possible regardless of what actually happened. The central character on the side of the heroes, if we are using that word loosely, is a man named Billy Butcher. He is a deeply complicated, frequently infuriating, and occasionally oddly touching character who operates the group known as the Boys. His motivation is personal in the most devastating way possible. His wife Becca had a connection to Homelander, the most powerful and most dangerous supe, and that connection destroyed his family. Butcher's entire mission is built around grief and rage, and the show is honest enough to admit that grief and rage make a person do things they should not do. He is not a clean hero. He is barely a hero at all in the conventional sense. But there is something about him that keeps you invested. Homelander himself is one of the genuinely remarkable villain creations in modern television. He is a Superman parody on the surface, same general look, same general power set, flying and laser vision and enormous physical strength. But where Superman is idealized goodness, Homelander is idealized goodness as a performance hiding something completely hollow underneath. He grew up without love, raised in a laboratory environment, tested and studied and never held or comforted or treated like a child rather than an experiment. And what that created is a person of almost limitless physical power and almost no genuine emotional foundation. He craves approval constantly. He needs people to love him. And when they do not, or when he suspects they do not, the response is terrifying. The actor who plays him is Anthony Starr, who is from New Zealand and was not particularly famous before this role. Watching him play Homelander is one of those experiences where you genuinely forget there is an actor doing work. He has this quality in the performance where the character can switch from warm and paternal to cold and menacing in a fraction of a second, and the transition is smooth enough that you are never quite sure which version is real. The answer the show eventually gives you is that neither version is entirely real, which is somehow more disturbing than either option on its own. The show is also quite deliberate about the way it uses its superhero aesthetics to talk about celebrity culture, corporate power, and the way media shapes what people believe about the world. The Vought News network in the show is an obvious parallel to certain real-world media organizations, and the way it manages the narratives around the superheroes mirrors the way public relations and media management work in practice. Nothing about the heroic image is accidental. Every appearance, every statement, every charity event is calibrated. One of the show's most interesting recurring threads is the way it handles religion and faith. As the series progresses, Vought begins exploring the idea of positioning Homelander not just as a celebrity or a hero but as something closer to a divine figure. The logic behind this is almost frighteningly straightforward once you hear it. If you can convince people that someone is not just powerful but holy, their loyalty becomes essentially unshakable. Criticism becomes not just wrong but sinful. And the person at the center of that devotion can do whatever they want because their authority is now framed as sacred rather than institutional. This is why the show is so layered even when it seems like it is just being shocking for its own sake. The shocking moments exist on the surface, but underneath them there is always an argument being made about something real. The question of how power maintains itself, how institutions protect themselves, how ordinary people get caught up in systems they did not design and sometimes cannot see clearly from inside. Annie January, who uses the name Starlight publicly, is another deeply interesting character. She arrived at the Seven with genuine idealism, actually believing in the heroic mission, and the show spent considerable time documenting the slow erosion of that idealism as she learned what the organization actually was. What makes her compelling is that she does not simply become cynical. She fights to hold on to something real even as everything around her tries to corrupt or dismiss it. Her relationship with Huey Campbell, the other major character on the side of the boys, is one of the emotional anchors of the whole series. Huey started the whole story as a relatively ordinary guy who got pulled into this world after a tragedy involving one of the Supes. He is fundamentally decent, which sounds like a small thing but is actually quite rare in this universe. He sometimes overcorrects and becomes too passive or too deferential, but the show keeps bringing him back to his own sense of right and wrong. His relationship with Annie is interesting partly because they represent two different approaches to the same question, which is how do you maintain your humanity inside systems designed to strip it away from you? The show also features a character called Mother's Milk, whose nickname has an unusual and very specific origin that the show explains. He is the moral center of the boys in many ways, more grounded and more consistent than Butcher, more experienced and more cautious than Huey. He has a complicated family life, and the tension between his responsibilities to that family and his responsibilities to the mission is something the show returns to repeatedly. He represents the cost that this kind of work extracts from a person over time. Frenchie and Kimiko are another pairing worth thinking about on a quiet night. Frenchie is a chemist and a weapons specialist with a chaotic past and a gift for unexpected warmth. Kimiko was a captive who had Compound V administered against her will and developed superhuman abilities as a result. She does not speak, which is a creative choice that forces the show to develop her character entirely through action and expression and her dynamic with Frenchie. Their relationship becomes one of the most genuinely tender things the show contains, which is a notable achievement given everything else happening around them. The Deep is a character who started as a simple parody of Aquaman but gradually became something more complicated as the series continued. He talks to marine animals, which is played for a mixture of comedy and pathos in equal measure. He is deeply insecure, frequently incompetent, and was pushed out of the Seven under circumstances the show handles with surprising seriousness. His attempts to rehabilitate his public image and find meaning take him through some genuinely strange places, and his relationship with the ocean creatures he interacts with becomes oddly moving. A-Train is another hero who began as a parody figure, a speedster whose whole brand is about being the fastest, but who gradually accumulated more complexity. Questions about performance enhancement, about what it costs to maintain superhuman performance long-term, about race and representation within the Vought system. The show uses his storyline to examine how institutions make promises about diversity and inclusion while actually doing the opposite of those things at every structural level. Queen Maeve is a Wonder Woman analog who appears to have everything but has been grinding herself down for years maintaining a performance of heroism she no longer believes in. Her arc involves the exhaustion of pretending and the complicated possibility of stopping. Stillwell was a character who represented Vaught's corporate face, someone who understood exactly what the company was and managed it with cold efficiency. Her relationship with Homelander was one of the most psychologically unusual dynamics in the early seasons. The comic book origins of many characters are worth knowing about. In the comics, some characters have very different fates and motivations than their television counterparts. The show's creative team made deliberate choices about which elements to adapt directly and which to rethink entirely. In some cases, the television versions of characters are considerably more sympathetic than their source material counterparts. In other cases, the show intensifies certain qualities that the comics only sketched. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which doubles convincingly for various American cities. The production design is one of its quiet strengths. The Seven Tower has a very specific visual language, all gleaming surfaces and corporate aspirational architecture. The Boys' base of operations looks like the exact opposite, cramped and functional and chaotic. The contrast is doing real work in terms of establishing what each side of the conflict represents. The music choices in The Boys are consistently interesting. The show has a habit of placing extremely cheerful or romantically familiar songs against scenes of considerable violence or darkness, and this juxtaposition creates a specific tonal effect. It keeps you slightly off balance. It refuses to let the violence feel entirely heavy or entirely weightless. There is something about hearing an upbeat track during a moment of chaos that mirrors the way the show treats its corporate villains. Everything packaged pleasantly regardless of what it actually contains. One of the recurring themes of the show is about what happens to idealism when it encounters power. Almost every character in The Boys has some version of this arc. They believed in something, or they chose to believe in something, or they were sold something worth believing in, and then reality arrived. How each character processes that collision between belief and reality defines what they become. Some become cynical. Some become violent. Some find a way to hold on to something worth holding on to. The show does not always tell you which response is correct, and that ambiguity is part of what makes it interesting to think about. The satirical targets shift somewhat as the show progresses. Early on, it is primarily about celebrity culture and corporate behavior. As it continues, it broadens to include social media dynamics, political radicalization, the way media ecosystems create closed loops of belief, and the specific mechanics of how cults of personality form and grow. These themes are not subtle, but they are handled with enough specificity to feel genuinely observed rather than just reactive. The Compound V mythology expands considerably as the show progresses. We learn more about its history, where it came from, how it was developed, how it was used over decades before the show's present-day events. Some of this history involves experiments on soldiers without their knowledge or consent, which is one of the darker corners of the law. The show uses this history to complicate the idea that the soup problem is recent or unprecedented. The roots of it go back much further than most people in the world of the show understand. Soldier Boy is a character introduced in the third season who represents a different era of Vaught's ambitions. He is presented as the original superhero, the first successful Compound V product, and his existence raises interesting questions about the mythology the company built. Jensen Ackles, who plays him, brings a specific quality to the role that plays interestingly against the other characters. The character's relationship to contemporary events is complicated by the fact that he is essentially a product of a completely different cultural moment who has been thrust into the present without adequate preparation. The Black Noir character has one of the more unusual trajectories in the show, involving questions of identity and what lies beneath the mask in both literal and figurative senses. The Sage character, introduced in later seasons, is fascinating because she represents intelligence weaponized entirely in service of power. She is the smartest person in most rooms but has chosen to deploy that intelligence in ways that raise deep questions about what intelligence without ethics actually produces. The relationship between the boys and Vought is not simply one of good versus evil, though it sometimes appears that way on the surface. The boys operate outside the law, frequently cause collateral damage, make terrible decisions, and have genuine moral failures. Vought is clearly worse in most ways, but the show is interested in the question of whether fighting something makes you like it, whether the methods you choose contaminate the cause you are fighting for. This is not a show with clean heroes and dirty villains. The dirt is distributed fairly widely. As the series moves toward its later seasons, the stakes escalate in ways that feel earned by the groundwork laid earlier. The question of what would happen if someone with Homelander's power and psychological profile accumulated genuine political and religious authority becomes less hypothetical and more immediate. The show starts asking what the end of this story looks like, what the world on the other side of all of this conflict might be, whether anything can actually be fixed or whether certain things once broken stay broken. The show has developed an enormous following that engages with it on multiple levels simultaneously. Some people watch purely for the chaos and spectacle. Some watch for the satire and the commentary. Some watch for the character work and the emotional storylines. The show manages to deliver enough of each of these things to hold all of those audiences. The trick is that none of those layers undermines the others. The satire makes the spectacle more meaningful. The character work makes the satire feel human rather than abstract. The chaos makes the quieter moments land harder by contrast. There is something worth appreciating in the fact that a show this deliberately extreme is also one of the more thoughtfully constructed pieces of television currently being made. It knows what it is saying. It knows why it is saying it. And underneath all the loudness, there is a genuine investment in the question of what ordinary people are supposed to do when the systems they live inside turn out to be corrupt at every level. That question does not have an easy answer. The show knows it does not have an easy answer, but it keeps asking anyway. So as you drift off tonight, let that sit with you gently. A world of impossible powers and entirely human problems. Corporate towers with gleaming facades and rotting interiors. Characters trying to find something worth holding onto in the middle of everything falling apart. The Boys is loud and chaotic and frequently very funny and occasionally genuinely moving, and it is asking questions that do not go away just because the episode ends. Sleep well. The world will still be there in the morning. Superhero optional. What if I told you that one of the most disturbing television shows ever made is actually perfect to fall asleep to? Yeah, I know that sounds completely backwards. The Boys, Amazon Prime's brutally honest superhero satire, just dropped its 4th season, and whether you've watched every episode wide awake or you're someone who loves drifting off to the sound of interesting facts and behind-the-scenes details, you are in exactly the right place tonight. So get comfortable, pull your blanket up, close your eyes if you want, and let me walk you through some of the most fascinating things about the Boys season for that even hardcore fans might not know. We are going deep on the creative choices, the real-world inspirations, the actor experiences, and the little details hidden in plain sight throughout the season. No jump scares, no sudden loud moments, just a calm and thorough journey through one of the most ambitious seasons of television in recent memory. The Boys Season 4 arrived on Prime Video in June of 2024, and from the very first episode it made clear that showrunner Eric Kripke and his team had no intention of pulling any punches. The season picks up in the aftermath of the events of Season 3, with the political and social landscape of the show's universe feeling more relevant and more uncomfortably close to our own reality than ever before. That sense of uncomfortable familiarity is something the creative team has always leaned into, but Season 4 took it to an entirely different level, drawing from headlines, political movements, and cultural anxieties in ways that sparked massive conversations online. One of the most talked about aspects of Season 4 was the character of Homelander, played with terrifying brilliance by Anthony Starr. What many viewers don't realize is how much physical and psychological preparation Anthony Starr puts into each season of this show. For Season 4, Starr has spoken in interviews about the challenge of portraying a character who is simultaneously becoming more unhinged and more powerful. The writing team gave Homelander storylines that pushed the character's narcissism and need for validation to completely new extremes, and Starr had to find ways to make those moments feel authentic rather than cartoonish. The result was a performance that earned enormous critical praise, with many reviewers calling it the best work Starr has done across the entire series. Now here is something genuinely interesting about how the show handles its villain. Kripke and the writers have been very open about the fact that Homelander is deliberately designed to mirror certain real-world figures without being a direct one-to-one copy of any specific person. The goal, as the creative team has explained it, is to capture something more universal about the psychology of unchecked power, about what happens when someone with enormous capabilities is never held accountable and is constantly surrounded by people who either fear them or worship them. That psychological portrait is researched carefully, and the writers have consulted materials on authoritarian personality types, cult dynamics, and the psychology of celebrity to shape how Homelander behaves in Season 4. Speaking of research, the production team for The Boys is known for doing extraordinary amounts of homework before every season. For Season 4, the writers' room reportedly spent months studying political movements, media manipulation tactics, and corporate lobbying practices to ensure the satirical elements of the show felt grounded and specific rather than vague. This is part of why the show resonates so deeply with audiences. It is not just throwing wild ideas at the wall. Every exaggerated moment in The Boys tends to have a real-world anchor point that makes it hit harder than pure fantasy ever could. Let us talk for a moment about the production design of Season 4, because it is genuinely remarkable and not enough people discuss it. The visual world of The Boys has always been meticulously constructed to feel like our world with the volume turned up slightly. In Season 4, the design team put enormous effort into the Vought Corporation's aesthetic, expanding and deepening the visual language of what is essentially the show's central villain organization. The way Vought spaces are designed tells you everything you need to know about how the corporation sees itself. Clean, powerful, aspirational. All chrome and glass and American flags. It is visual propaganda built into architecture, and the production designers made very deliberate choices about every space Vought characters inhabit. The Seven, Vaught's flagship superhero team, got some significant changes in Season 4, and the costume and makeup departments had their hands full keeping up with the evolving nature of each character. The superhero suits in The Boys are not spandex and foam rubber. They are incredibly intricate garments made from high-quality materials that have to be both visually impressive on camera and functional enough for the actors to actually move in. Each suit reportedly takes weeks to construct and thousands of dollars worth of materials. When characters get new suit variations or when suits need to show damage and wear, the costume team essentially has to build entirely new pieces rather than simply modifying existing ones. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, had one of the most dramatically complex arcs of Season 4, and Urban has talked publicly about how much he enjoys the challenge this character presents. Butcher is a character defined by contradiction. He is brutal and manipulative and genuinely dangerous, but there is also something deeply wounded and human at his core, and Urban works hard to keep both of those things visible simultaneously. For Season 4 in particular, The writing gave Butcher storylines dealing with mortality and legacy that required Urban to bring genuine emotional weight to scenes that could easily have felt melodramatic in less skilled hands. It is the kind of writing and performance combination that elevates genre television into something that genuinely matters. Here is a detail many casual viewers miss. The Boys is actually an adaptation of a comic book series created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, published by Wildstorm and later Dynamite Entertainment between 2006 and 2012. The show has always taken significant liberties with its source material, expanding, changing, and sometimes entirely reimagining characters and storylines. By season 4, the television version has diverged so substantially from the comics that viewers who have read the original source material are often just as surprised by plot developments as those who have never picked up a single issue. This is a conscious choice by the showrunners, who wanted the series to be its own living thing rather than simply a faithful adaptation. The relationship between the comic and the show is actually a fascinating study in how source material can be honored in spirit, while being radically transformed in execution. Garth Ennis, the original comics writer, has been publicly supportive of the television adaptation even though it takes the story in very different directions. Part of what makes this interesting is that Ennis himself was writing a satirical critique of superhero culture, corporate power, and American exceptionalism back in the mid-2000s, and Kripke's team has found ways to update those themes for a very different cultural moment while keeping the core provocative energy of the original work intact. Now let us drift into something a little more technical and perhaps more soothing to think about. The visual effects work on The Boys Season 4 is staggering in its scale and ambition. This is a show that requires hundreds of individual visual effects shots per episode, everything from the relatively simple removal of wires and harnesses when actors appear to be flying, to extraordinarily complex sequences involving superpowers being used in violent and creative ways. The VFX team on The Boys has grown substantially with each season as the show's ambitions have expanded, and Season 4 reportedly had one of the largest visual effects budgets of any streaming show in 2024. One of the most technically challenging aspects of the visual effects work involves scenes where multiple super-powered characters interact with each other and with environments simultaneously. Coordinating those sequences requires incredibly detailed pre-visualization work, where the entire sequence is essentially mapped out in a rough digital format before filming even begins. This previs process can take weeks or even months for particularly complex sequences, and it involves close collaboration between the directors, the stunt coordinators, the VFX supervisors, and the actors themselves. By the time a major action sequence actually gets filmed, everyone involved has essentially rehearsed it dozens of times in various forms. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has one of the most nuanced roles in Season 4. Her character has been on an extraordinary journey across the series, moving from naive idealism to hard-won cynicism to something more complicated and interesting than either of those things. Moriarty has spoken about the responsibility she feels toward this character, particularly because Annie resonates so strongly with young women in the audience who see their own experiences with disillusionment and resilience reflected in her story. Season 4 gave Moriarty material that explored new dimensions of Annie's character, and she has been clear in interviews that the collaborative atmosphere on set is a significant part of what makes those performances possible. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of its greatest strengths, and Season 4 made excellent use of the established chemistry between these performers. Shows that have been running for multiple seasons sometimes struggle to keep ensemble dynamics feeling fresh, but The Boys has consistently managed to find new combinations of characters to put in scenes together, which keeps the interpersonal dynamics from going stale. Some of the most compelling moments in Season 4 come from unexpected pairings of characters who do not often share screen time, and those moments tend to generate some of the most memorable performances of the season. Let us talk about the music for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the show's secret weapons. The Boys has always had a masterful approach to music supervision, selecting needle drops that create ironic contrast between what is being shown on screen and what is being heard on the soundtrack. Season 4 continued this tradition with some genuinely inspired choices that viewers have endlessly discussed and debated online. The selection of songs is never random. Each piece of music is chosen to add a layer of commentary to whatever scene it accompanies, and the music supervisors work closely with the directors and the showrunner to ensure that the tonal balance between horror and dark comedy is maintained throughout. The original score of the show is also worth appreciating separately from the licensed music. The composer who works on The Boys has developed a distinctive sonic palette for the series over its run, and that score is subtler than the attention-grabbing needle drops but just as carefully crafted. The orchestral and electronic elements of the score work to create a sense of unease that runs beneath even the show's lighter moments, reminding viewers that this is fundamentally a dark world even when things appear to be going well for the characters. Here is something interesting about how Season 4 was written. The writer's room for The Boys is known for being a particularly creative and collaborative space, but it is also an intense one. Kripke has described the process of breaking stories for each season as involving enormous amounts of debate, with writers pushing each other to go further and be more specific in their critiques and their character work. For Season 4, some story ideas were apparently discussed for weeks before being either refined into something that made it to screen or set aside entirely. The ideas that get cut are often just as wild as the ones that end up in the show, which gives you some sense of the creative ambition at work in that room. The political satire in Season 4 was particularly pointed, and this generated a fascinating cultural phenomenon where people across the political spectrum simultaneously claimed the show was critiquing the other side. This is actually a testament to the sophistication of the writing. The show manages to create a funhouse mirror version of contemporary politics that reflects genuinely troubling dynamics in ways that feel recognizable without being so specifically partisan that they alienate half the audience immediately. Kripke has talked about this balance in numerous interviews, describing it as one of the ongoing creative challenges of making the show. Now, as you settle in and let your breathing slow down a little, let me tell you about the filming locations for Season 4. The Boys is primarily filmed in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for various American cities throughout the show's run. The production makes extensive use of Toronto's diverse architecture and neighborhoods, along with studio work at the city's major production facilities. For Season 4, the production reportedly used a wider variety of locations than previous seasons, partly to reflect the expanding scope of the story and partly to keep the visual experience of the show feeling fresh. Location scouts for a production like The Boys have an extraordinarily detailed job, finding spaces that can plausibly represent specific American settings while also being practical for filming. The stunt work in The Boys deserves its own dedicated appreciation. The stunt coordinators on this show are responsible for designing and executing some of the most creative and violent action sequences on television, and they do so while ensuring the safety of everyone involved. For Season 4, the stunt team developed several sequences that required entirely new approaches because the specific superpowers and situations involved had never been done before on the show. This is one of the ongoing creative challenges of working on a series with an ever-expanding set of superhuman abilities. Every new power essentially requires the stunt and visual effects teams to develop new techniques. Something that casual viewers might not appreciate is how much rehearsal time goes into even relatively brief action scenes. A sequence that takes up 30 seconds of screen time might represent multiple full days of rehearsal and filming. The actors who perform their own stunts in those sequences, and several of the main cast members do quite a bit of their own stunt work, spend considerable time working with the stunt coordinators to ensure that the movements feel authentic and that they can be executed safely at the required intensity. This collaborative process between actors and stunt professionals is one of the less glamorous but genuinely fascinating aspects of how a show like this gets made. Let us take a quiet moment and think about the writing of individual episodes in Season 4. Each episode of The Boys is a complex piece of work that has to balance multiple storylines, advance character development, deliver on the show's satirical agenda, and satisfy the entertainment expectations of a very engaged and demanding audience. The writers who work on individual episodes bring different strengths to the table, and the variation in tone between episodes is often a reflection of which writer or writing team took the lead on a particular installment. Some episodes lean harder into the dark comedy, others into the horror elements, and still others prioritize emotional character work. The skill of the showrunner lies in making all of those variations feel like part of a coherent whole. The directors of Season 4 came from a variety of backgrounds, and bringing in different directorial perspectives is a deliberate strategy on prestige television productions like this one. Each director brings their own visual sensibility and interpretive approach to the material, while working within the established look and feel of the show. The challenge for directors joining an ongoing series is understanding and honoring what has come before while also bringing something genuinely fresh to their episodes. The Boys has been successful at this balancing act because the showrunners are very clear about the fundamental visual and tonal rules of the series, while also giving directors meaningful creative latitude within those parameters. One of the most discussed aspects of Season 4 was its exploration of found family dynamics and the way that trauma shapes bonds between people. The core group of characters around Billy Butcher has always functioned as a kind of broken family, people who have been hurt by the world in specific ways and who have found each other partly out of necessity and partly out of something more genuine. Season 4 pushed these dynamics in new directions, testing the bonds between characters in ways that felt emotionally authentic rather than contrived. This is the kind of emotional work that separates shows that are merely entertaining from shows that leave a lasting impression on audiences. The casting of guest and recurring characters in Season 4 was handled with particular care. The show has always made excellent use of its supporting cast, and Season 4 introduced some new characters who were received warmly by audiences and critics alike. The casting process for a show like The Boys involves finding actors who can match the very specific energy the series requires, which is a delicate combination of dramatic capability, comedic timing, physical presence, and the willingness to commit fully to material that can be quite extreme. The casting directors who work on the show have developed a strong sense of what The Boys needs from its performers, and that institutional knowledge shows in the consistency of the casting quality. Here is a softer detail to think about as you drift. Many of the props used throughout Season 4 contain hidden details and jokes that are invisible at normal viewing distance, and often only caught by audience members who pause their screens or watch extremely carefully. The production design team puts enormous effort into creating a fully realized fictional world, and that includes populating that world with fake advertisements, fake news broadcasts, fake social media posts, and fake product packaging that all contain jokes and Easter eggs. Some of these details reference previous events in the show's history, others are pure jokes for their own sake, and finding them has become a beloved activity for the show's most dedicated fan community. The fan community around The Boys is itself a fascinating cultural phenomenon worth thinking about. The show has generated one of the most active and creative fan communities in contemporary streaming television, with fans producing art, fan fiction, analysis essays, video essays, and detailed annotation of each episode that sometimes reveals details the creators themselves had forgotten including. The relationship between the show and its fan community has been notably warm, with Kripke and many of the cast members being quite active on social media and engaging with fan responses to episodes. This kind of creator-to-audience dialogue has become more common in the streaming era, but The Boys has made it particularly central to how the show exists in the culture. Season 4 dealt extensively with themes of legacy, specifically the question of what people leave behind and whether any individual action can meaningfully change large structural problems. These philosophical questions are embedded in the plot and character work, but they are never stated explicitly. Instead, they emerge from the specific situations the characters find themselves in and the choices they make under pressure. This is sophisticated thematic writing, and it is part of why the show is taken seriously as social commentary rather than dismissed as simply extreme content for shock value. The balance between extreme content and genuine emotional depth is one of the defining creative achievements of The Boys as a series. The show contains material that is something quieter. Think about the editing of Season 4, which is a craft that operates largely invisibly when it is working correctly. The editors on The Boys are responsible for assembling the footage from multiple filming days into coherent scenes, then assembling those scenes into episodes, and working closely with the showrunner and directors to ensure that pacing, tone, and emphasis are all hitting the intended targets. Season 4 reportedly went through significant editing work in post-production, with some sequences being substantially reworked based on early screenings and feedback. This kind of iterative editing process is common on prestige television, and the sound team is responsible for creating an immersive audio environment that makes the superhero violence feel real and grounded rather than cartoonish. This involves creating original sound effects for things that have no real-world equivalent, things like specific superpowers being used in specific ways. The sound designers draw from enormous libraries of recorded sounds and combine and transform them to create new sonic textures. Season 4 had some particularly impressive sound design moments, where the audio work was doing as much emotional work as the visuals. One thing that has been noted by critics and viewers alike about Season 4 is how well it developed its female characters in particular. The show has always taken the experiences of its female characters seriously, using their storylines to examine specific forms of power imbalance and exploitation that are distinct from what the male characters face. Season 4 expanded on this, giving characters like Starlight, Kimiko, and others material that felt both specific to their established personalities and genuinely surprising in its emotional depth. The writers who worked most closely on these character arcs have spoken about doing deliberate research to ensure these storylines felt authentic rather than exploitative. The character of Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, has one of the show's most distinctive communication challenges because the character does not speak. All of Kimiko's emotional expression has to come through physical performance and context, which is a genuinely difficult acting challenge that Fukuhara handles with remarkable skill. Season forgave Fukuhara material that expanded the emotional range of this character in ways that were visually inventive and emotionally resonant, and the work she does is consistently cited by critics as one of the show's underappreciated strengths. Let the thoughts drift a little now, like leaves moving slow across water. The Boys is a show that asks its audience to sit with discomfort, to recognize things about the world we live in reflected in its distorted mirror, and to keep watching even when what is being shown is not pleasant. That is a challenging proposition, and the fact that millions of people have accepted that invitation season after season speaks to something real about the quality and the relevance of the work. Season 4 deepened that relationship with its audience, delivering a season that was darker and more emotionally ambitious than its predecessors while never losing the irreverent energy that made the show compelling in the first place. There is something worth appreciating about how long-form television storytelling works at its best. Characters in a series like The Boys develop over years of audience time, and the cumulative emotional weight of that development means that moments in Season 4 land with a force that would be impossible to achieve without everything that came before. When a character makes a choice that reflects who they have become over 4 seasons of story, the impact of that moment is multiplied by all of the history the audience brings to it. This is the specific gift of serialized storytelling, and The Boys uses it with genuine sophistication. As you settle deeper and the words become more like soft sounds than things you have to actively process, consider this. The people who make The Boys, the writers and directors and actors and designers and visual effects artists and editors and everyone else in the enormous collaborative enterprise that produces a season of television are doing work that they clearly care about deeply. The ambition and craft on display in Season 4 is not the product of cynical commercial calculation alone. There is genuine artistic investment in the show, a belief that it matters, that what it says about power and accountability and human nature is worth saying, and worth saying well. The Boys Season 4 is not perfect television. No season of any show is. But it is television that takes its audience seriously, that trusts viewers to engage with complex material and to follow character arcs through genuine darkness towards something that feels, if not exactly hopeful, then at least honest about the world. That combination of entertainment and purpose is rarer than it should be, and when it works, it is worth appreciating. So let those thoughts settle now. The Vought Towers gleaming in the fictional skyline. The complicated people doing complicated things in a world that feels uncomfortably familiar. The enormous craft and effort that goes into every frame. All of it can rest quietly at the edges of awareness now as your breathing slows and the night gets quieter around you. The Boys will be there when you wake up, ready to be watched with full attention, but for now, let the facts and the details and the appreciation for good work done carefully drift you gently towards sleep. Season 4 delivered. The people who made it cared. And that is a comforting thought to carry into rest. Picture this. You're lying in bed, lights off, maybe a little too tired to watch anything but not quite tired enough to actually fall asleep. Your brain is still buzzing. You need something interesting. Something that pulls you in without demanding too much from you. Something that rewards you for just listening. Well, tonight you are in exactly the right place. Because we are diving deep into one of the most brilliantly written, shockingly creative, and genuinely underrated seasons of television ever made. Season 2 of The Boys. And whether you watched it when it first dropped or you've seen it a dozen times, I promise you there are things about this season that will genuinely surprise you. Details you probably missed. Behind-the-scenes stories that make the whole thing even more impressive. And facts that reveal just how much thought went into every single frame. So get comfortable. Settle in. And let's talk about The Boys Season 2 in a way you've never heard before. Let's start with the thing that makes Season 2 so remarkable compared to its predecessor. When Season 1 dropped, nobody really knew what to expect. The Boys arrived as this loud, irreverent, politically charged antidote to superhero fatigue, and audiences were genuinely shocked by how far it was willing to go. But here's the thing about shock value. It only works once. The second time around, you can't just do the same tricks. You have to evolve. And the creative team behind The Boys understood that completely. Season 2 wasn't just more of the same. It was a deliberate deepening of everything the show was trying to say. The satire got sharper. The characters got more complex. And the storytelling became genuinely layered in ways that rewarded close attention. One of the most fascinating aspects of Season 2 is how it handled the introduction of Stormfront. And let me tell you, the casting of Aya Cash in that role was one of the most inspired decisions the show ever made. Before The Boys, Aya Cash was perhaps best known for her comedic work, and that background turned out to be absolutely crucial to how the character worked. Stormfront is terrifying precisely because she's charming. She's funny. She's relatable. She speaks in this casual, internet-savvy language that makes her feel like someone you might actually follow on social media. And that is the point. The show was using her character to make a very specific and very pointed argument about how modern extremism operates. It doesn't announce itself with a red flag and a manifesto. It comes wrapped in humor and charisma and relatability. The fact that Aya Cash could deliver that performance with such precision while also making it feel completely natural is genuinely extraordinary. Now here's something that might genuinely surprise you. The character of Stormfront in the original comic books is actually a male character. A fairly straightforward neo-Nazi villain without the kind of complexity or social commentary layered into the television version. The decision to reimagine that character as a woman, and specifically to frame her as this social media-savvy, image-conscious, deeply manipulative figure, was a creative choice made specifically for the show. And it transformed what could have been a one-note antagonist into something that actually says something real about the world we live in. The showrunners were looking at the rise of online radicalization and the way that certain ideological movements had learned to rebrand themselves using the aesthetics of progressivism and internet culture. Stormfront is the fictional embodiment of that very real phenomenon. Let's talk about Karl Urban for a moment, because Billy Butcher is one of the great performances currently on television, and Season 2 really pushed that character into new territory. What a lot of people don't know is that Karl Urban brings a lot of himself to that role. The physicality, the accent, the sheer intensity of how he inhabits Butcher. There's a rawness to it that doesn't feel entirely performed. Urban has talked about finding the character's anger very accessible because the things Butcher is angry about, the abuse of power, the corruption of institutions, the way ordinary people get ground up by systems designed to protect the powerful, those are things that genuinely resonate with him. Season 2 in particular gave Urban some of the most emotionally demanding material of his entire career, particularly in the scenes involving Butcher's wife Becca and his complicated relationship with her son Ryan. Watching Butcher navigate that relationship is watching a man who has built his entire identity around hatred suddenly confronted with the possibility that love might require something more from him. The character of Ryan, who is Homelander's biological son, is another element that Season 2 uses with remarkable intelligence. Because Ryan is not a villain. He is a child. A deeply confused, genuinely frightened child who has been raised in complete isolation by a mother who is trying to protect him from both Vought and from his own father. The show never lets you forget that. Even as Homelander becomes increasingly unhinged and the threat he represents becomes more acute, Ryan remains this figure of pure innocence caught in the middle. And the way Season 2 explores the idea that children can be either the best or worst thing that happens to someone like Homelander, that his son could either redeem him or destroy whatever was left of his humanity, is genuinely sophisticated storytelling. Speaking of Homelander, Anthony Starr's performance in Season 2 is something that genuinely deserves to be studied. There is a scene in the season where Homelander is alone, standing on a rooftop, and he begins laughing and crying simultaneously in this way that is profoundly disturbing. It communicates everything you need to know about where this character is psychologically without a single word of dialogue. Anthony Starr has spoken about the research he did for the role, looking at how narcissistic personality disorder manifests, how people who have never developed a secure sense of identity behave when that identity is threatened. Season 2 is really where that research pays off most visibly, because the threat to Homelander's identity in this season isn't external. It's internal. He is forced to confront the fact that he might not actually be the good guy he has always needed to believe he was. Now let's talk about something that comes up a lot when people discuss The Boys, and that is the show's relationship to real superhero franchises. The satire is obviously pointed at the MCU and DCU in general terms, but Season 2 gets quite specific. The idea of superheroes being used to justify military intervention, the manipulation of public perception around supers being deployed overseas, the congressional hearings about superhero accountability, all of this is clearly in conversation with real debates that were happening in American political culture at the time. And the show doesn't pretend to be neutral about any of it. The Boys has a point of view, and Season 2 sharpens that point of view considerably. The superheroes in this show are not metaphors for something vague. They are very specific metaphors for corporate power, for the military-industrial complex, for media manipulation, and for the way celebrity culture insulates the powerful from accountability. Here's a fascinating production detail that most viewers have no idea about. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, not in the United States. And yet it needs to convincingly depict New York City, various American small towns, government buildings, and corporate headquarters. The production design team on The Boys is working at an extraordinarily high level to make Toronto stand in for all of these locations, and Season 2 in particular required some incredibly creative problem-solving to pull off certain key sequences. The city of Toronto and its surrounding areas have a remarkable flexibility as a filming location, but matching the specific visual language of New York requires a level of attention to detail that the show's crew has become almost legendary for delivering. Let's shift to talking about Deep, because the arc that Chase Crawford is given in Season 2 is one of the most underrated storytelling choices the entire show has made. Deep was introduced in Season 1 as a fairly simple villain, a harasser who uses his position of power to exploit women and faces no consequences. Season 2 recontextualizes that character in a genuinely unexpected way. It doesn't excuse what he did, not even slightly. But it does explore the psychology of how someone ends up becoming that kind of person. The Church of the Collective subplot, which is clearly modeled on Scientology, is used to examine how predatory organizations exploit people who are already damaged, who are already desperate for belonging and validation. Deep is pathetic in Season 2, and that is precisely the point. The show is asking you to understand him without asking you to forgive him. The Gills scene. If you know, you know. And if you don't know, you're in for quite a surprise. There is a scene in Season 2 involving Deep's Gills that is among the most audacious, genuinely strange pieces of television I've ever encountered. It manages to be simultaneously absurd and emotionally sincere, which is a combination almost no other show has ever successfully achieved. What's remarkable about that scene is that it actually advances the character. It's not shock for shock's sake. The scene is about Deep confronting his own body, his own identity, his own sense of self-worth, through this deeply weird lens. The fact that the writers found a way to use something so bizarre to say something genuine about body image and self-acceptance is a testament to how carefully the show is actually constructed. Now let me tell you something about the writing process for Season 2 that really illuminates why the season feels so cohesive. The writer's room for The Boys operates somewhat differently from many other prestige television shows. Showrunner Eric Kripke, who also created Supernatural, has talked about the importance of having writers in the room who come from very different political and cultural backgrounds. The show doesn't want an echo chamber. It wants genuine debate about what the satire should be targeting, how far to push things, what actually constitutes meaningful commentary versus mere provocation. Season 2 in particular benefited from this approach because it was dealing with subject matter, the rise of white nationalist movements, online radicalization, media complicity and extremism, that required a nuanced and thoughtful approach to avoid either trivializing the issue or becoming preachy about it. Eric Kripke has been remarkably candid in interviews about the fact that the show often writes itself into positions that make him personally uncomfortable. Not because the content is gratuitous, but because the satire forces him to examine things he would rather not examine. The character of Homelander, for example, has become in some corners of the internet a figure of admiration rather than horror. Fans who identify with his worldview, who see his contempt for ordinary people and his rage at those who would constrain him as something aspirational. Kripke has said that this is simultaneously the most disturbing and the most validating response to the show, because it confirms that what they're depicting is real and present in the culture, not something they've invented. Let's talk about the finale of Season 2, because it contains one of the most memorable moments in the show's entire run. The scene where a character's head explodes. I'll try to keep this relatively spoiler-light for anyone who might somehow be hearing this before watching. But that moment is not just a shock gag. It is the culmination of an entire season's worth of thematic work about the limits of corruption, about what happens when systems designed to manage dangerous people fail, and about the way violence has a way of turning back on those who use it as a tool. The visual effects team on that sequence spent an enormous amount of time getting the practicalities right, but more importantly, the writers spent enormous care setting up the emotional and narrative logic that makes the moment land as more than just gross spectacle. Here is something that I find genuinely fascinating about Season 2 from a structural perspective. It is a season about exposure. Almost every major character arc in the season involves some version of a secret being threatened. Vaught's secrets about Compound V, Homelander's secret about Becca and Ryan. Stormfront's secret history. The boys own secrets from each other. Even secondary characters like A-Train and Maeve are navigating questions about what happens when the lies they've been living start to unravel. The entire season operates around this central anxiety about revelation, about what it costs to keep things hidden and what it costs when they come to light. And this is not an accident. The theme is consistent from the first episode to the last, woven into every storyline simultaneously. Now here's a behind-the-scenes detail that really changed how I thought about the show. The costume design on The Boys is doing things that are easy to miss on a first watch. The soup costumes are designed to look like what a corporate marketing team would create if they were trying to sell heroism as a brand, not to evoke actual functionality or power. The textures, the colors, the little branding details. All of it is designed to read as product first and as superhero costume second. But in Season 2, there's a subtle evolution in some of the costumes that tracks character development. Starlight's costume in particular goes through changes that mirror her psychological journey through the season, her increasing resistance to Vaught's control, her reclamation of her own identity. These changes were entirely intentional. Elizabeth Shue joins the cast in Season 2 as Madeline Stillwell's replacement, and the character of Ashley brings something that the show really needed at that point in its run. A corporate villain who is just trying to survive, who isn't ideologically committed to anything beyond her own advancement, and who therefore represents the most common and perhaps most dangerous kind of complicity. Ashley isn't a true believer. She's just someone who has decided that the cost of resistance is too high. And watching her navigate the impossible demands of managing superheroes who could vaporize her with a look is both terrifying and darkly funny in exactly the right measure. Let me tell you about the music in Season 2, because this is another element that doesn't get nearly enough credit. The show's music supervisor has an almost supernatural ability to find needle-drop moments that recontextualize both the songs and the scenes they're placed in. There is a particular sequence in Season 2 set to a classic piece of music where the juxtaposition between the wholesome familiarity of the song and the absolute carnage unfolding on screen creates this vertiginous feeling that is entirely unique to the boys. The show understands that music is not just mood enhancement. It's commentary. The song choices in The Boys are always saying something about the scene they're soundtracking. Something that I want to highlight specifically for anyone who appreciates craft in storytelling is the way Season 2 handles the character of Mother's Milk. Laz Alonso gets some of the best material of his career in this season, and what makes it work is the tension between MM's desperate need for order and control, his meticulous, careful, methodical approach to everything, and the absolute chaos that defines his life as part of The Boys. Season 2 gives him a family subplot that grounds all of his psychological quirks in something emotionally real. His obsessive tendencies aren't played for comedy. They're shown as survival mechanisms developed by someone who has been unable to prevent terrible things from happening to people he loves. That's rich, careful character work. Now I want to spend some time on a detail that really reflects the show's commitment to internal consistency. The world of The Boys has its own internal logic around how powers work, how Compound V functions, and how the Vought Corporation has structured its entire operation around managing and monetising these abilities. Season 2 expands this worldview significantly. The congressional hearings about soups, the revelation about Compound V being given to people in other countries, the corporate and political machinery around all of this. It's extraordinarily detailed world building that rewards attention. The show clearly has documents, timelines, and histories for this world that never make it onto screen but that inform every decision the writers make. Here's something that might make you appreciate the show on a different level. The Boys films its more extreme violence and its more provocative content with a deliberate aesthetic that is meant to be uncomfortable rather than exciting. This is an intentional choice. In most action movies and superhero films, violence is choreographed to be cool. The camera angles, the editing rhythms, the sound design all work together to make it feel thrilling. The Boys deliberately subverts this. When violence happens in The Boys, it usually looks wrong. The camera doesn't glorify it. The editing makes it feel sudden and unglamorous. The sound design emphasizes the wet, physical reality of what's happening. This is the show making an argument with its filmmaking language about how we've been trained to consume violence as entertainment. Let's talk about the ending of Season 2 and what it sets up. Without going into too much detail, the season ends with Homelander in a genuinely interesting place. He has not been defeated. In fact, in some ways he has consolidated power. But his psychology has shifted. He has been forced to confront his own vulnerabilities in ways that he has not fully processed. And the dynamic with Ryan represents both his greatest potential weakness and his most dangerous new motivation. Season 3 of The Boys picks up threads from everything Season 2 planted, but the seeds are all right there in the final episodes of the second season if you know what to look for. One thing that often gets overlooked in discussions of The Boys is the performance of Jack Quaid as Huey Campbell. Huey is the audience surrogate character, the everyman who serves as our entry point into this world of superpowered horror. But Jack Quaid finds unexpected depths in what could have been a purely functional role. In Season 2 particularly, Huey goes through a crisis of his own effectiveness. He starts to question whether he is actually useful to the boys or whether he's just tagging along. And the choices he makes as a result of that crisis, some of them very wrong choices, feel earned because of the groundwork Quaid has been laying since episode 1. There's a really interesting piece of trivia about the casting process for The Boys that relates to Season 2 specifically. When they were searching for the right person to play Stormfront, the casting team reportedly went through an extensive search looking for someone who could thread a very specific needle. The character needed to be immediately likable. She needed to have the kind of warmth and charisma that makes you want to trust her. But there also needed to be something just slightly off, just barely perceptible, that a careful viewer might catch on a rewatch. Aya Cash nailed this so completely that several people involved in production have said they occasionally had to remind themselves during filming that the character was the villain. Now here is a piece of context that I think is genuinely important for understanding Season 2 and why it landed the way it did. The season was released in 2020, during an extraordinarily turbulent period in American and global history. The conversations the show was having about extremism, about institutional corruption, about the relationship between media and truth, these were not abstract conversations. They were conversations that were happening in real time, right alongside the show. And the creative team has talked about the strange and sometimes uncomfortable experience of watching their satire feel less like exaggeration and more like documentary as the year unfolded. That context of release doesn't just make the show feel prescient. It helps explain why it resonated so deeply with so many viewers. Let me tell you about the practical effects work in Season 2, because this show uses more practical effects than most people realize. The production takes a hybrid approach, combining CGI with practical elements in ways that keep things grounded. The gore, for instance, is frequently practical. The decision to use real practical effects for many of the show's more extreme physical moments is part of what gives the violence its particular quality of wrongness, that feeling that what you're seeing couldn't quite have been manufactured. There's a texture to practical effects that CGI still struggles to replicate perfectly, and the production designer and special effects coordinator on The Boys have been quite deliberate about preserving that texture. Something worth discussing is how Season 2 handles the representation of trauma, particularly among its female characters. Season 1 was criticized in some quarters for how it depicted sexual violence, with some arguing that it was too explicit, that it was using assault as a plot device rather than engaging meaningfully with its consequences. Season 2 responds to that criticism in interesting ways. The show is more thoughtful about giving its female characters agency in how they process and respond to what has been done to them. Maeve's arc in particular, her refusal to be used as a tool anymore regardless of the personal cost, feels like the show working through and deepening its approach to these themes. The show also does something really interesting with A-Train in Season 2. A-Train is not a sympathetic character. He made a terrible choice in Season 1 and then made it worse with his subsequent choices. But Season 2 gives him a storyline that forces you to hold two things at once simultaneously: his villainy and his victimhood. Because A-Train is also someone who has been exploited, who has been built up and then discarded by Vought, who has had his identity and his community weaponized against him. The show doesn't use this to forgive him, but it does use it to make the world feel more textured and real, because in the real world, people are frequently both. Here's a final behind-the-scenes detail that I love. The script for the season finale was rewritten multiple times right up until filming began, and even after filming began, certain elements were adjusted based on what the cast was bringing to the material. The performers on this show, particularly Anthony Starr and Carl Urban, are doing things with their characters that consistently surprise the writers and push them to find new angles. Television at its best is a collaborative art form, and The Boys Season 2 is a really beautiful example of what happens when you put genuinely talented people in a room together and give them the freedom and the trust to follow the work wherever it leads. What makes The Boys Season 2 ultimately so enduring as a piece of television is that it takes its audience seriously. It doesn't talk down to you. It doesn't pretend the world is simpler than it is. It looks directly at some of the most complicated and uncomfortable aspects of contemporary culture: the way we manufacture heroes, the way we consume outrage, the way power insulates itself from consequence, and it finds a way to make all of that viscerally entertaining without blunting the critique. That combination is extraordinarily rare. Shows that are genuinely funny, genuinely scary, genuinely provocative, and genuinely thoughtful at the same time don't come along very often. And the fact that Season 2 managed to raise the bar set by an already excellent first season is the thing that really cements its legacy. It would have been so easy to simply do more of the same. More blood, more shock, more outrage. But instead, the show chose to do something harder and more interesting. It chose to grow, to complicate, to ask harder questions and resist easier answers. Season 2 is where The Boys became not just a great genre show, but an actually important piece of popular culture. Something that was genuinely in conversation with its moment in a way that very few things achieve. So the next time you're drifting off and you want something interesting to think about, something that rewards the way your brain works when it's just slightly untethered from the demands of full consciousness, think about Stormfront and what she says about how modern extremism sells itself. Think about Homelander crying and laughing on that rooftop and what that tells you about the psychology of people who never learn to be accountable. Think about Butcher standing in the ruins of everything he thought he knew, looking at a little boy he didn't ask for, and choosing to be better than he has any natural inclination to be. The Boys Season 2 is not just great television. It's a mirror. And the thing about mirrors is they show you things you can't see any other way. Sleep well. And maybe when you wake up, watch it again.